Hello, welcome to the Whispered Abyss channel. Happy viewing. Lena Carter had always felt drawn to the strange and the macabre. A graduate art student with a flair for the dramatic, she often sought inspiration in the abandoned corners of her city. On an overcast afternoon, she wandered into an area she had never explored before. Narrow alleys twisted like veins through dilapidated buildings, and eventually, she found herself standing in front of an old art gallery. The weathered sign read Bellamy's Antiquities and Art. Its facade was dull and neglected, but something about it called to her. Pushing open the creaking door, Lena stepped into a world of forgotten treasures. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. Paintings and sculptures were crammed into every corner, each piece radiating a strange, almost oppressive energy. An elderly woman emerged from behind a cluttered desk, her pale blue eyes piercing, and her movements oddly deliberate. "Looking for something unusual?" the woman asked, her voice soft but commanding. Lena nodded, her gaze drifting to the walls adorned with eerie, shadowed landscapes and grotesque portraits. "I'm looking for inspiration," she said, almost uncertainly. Mrs. Bellamy's lips curled into a faint smile. "Then you've come to the right place." After some wandering, Lena's eyes fell on a painting hidden in the back of the gallery, covered by a thin, moth-eaten sheet. Intrigued, she peeled it back and froze. The painting depicted a figure cloaked in shadow, standing in the midst of roaring flames. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, if they could be called that, seemed to bore into her soul. The brush strokes were unnervingly lifelike, as though the painting itself were alive. "That one," Mrs. Bellamy said, her voice now a low murmur. "A cursed piece. Belonged to an artist who disappeared shortly after finishing it. People say it carries his torment." Lena shivered but couldn't tear her eyes away. "How much?" Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. "You don't want this one. It's brought nothing but misfortune." But Lena insisted, her curiosity overpowering her caution. The deal was struck, and she left the gallery with the painting wrapped in a burlap cover. As she carried it home, a strange weight settled over her. It wasn't just the physical burden of the canvas. It was as though the painting's presence was pressing against her very mind. That night, as she hung the painting in her studio, Lena felt both exhilarated and uneasy. Little did she know, her life was about to spiral into a nightmare she could never have imagined. The painting hung in Lena's studio, a sinister centerpiece that dominated the room. Even during the daylight hours, it seemed to pull in shadows, making the space feel dimmer and colder than it should. Lena spent hours studying the details, marveling at the way the flames seemed to flicker when viewed from the corner of her eye. The figure in the painting was enigmatic. Its stance exuded menace, yet it seemed to beckon her, inviting her into its dark world. That night, Lena sat at her desk, sketching furiously, inspired by the painting's eerie beauty. The scratching of her pencil against the paper filled the otherwise silent room. She didn't notice at first when the temperature dropped or when the shadows in the corners of her studio grew darker. It wasn't until she felt the faintest whisper against her ear, a sound too soft to be the wind, that she froze. Slowly, she turned her head toward the painting. The figure in the flames seemed closer. Lena blinked, her rational mind insisting it was a trick of the light. She laughed nervously and shook her head. "I've been staring at it too long," she muttered, turning back to her sketch. But the unease wouldn't leave her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the room. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally overcame her. She left her sketch unfinished and collapsed onto her bed, pulling the covers over herself. The painting hung in the darkness, a silent watcher. In the middle of the night, Lena woke to the sound of something scraping. It was faint at first, almost like the creak of an old door, but as her senses sharpened, she realized it was coming from the painting. Her heart raced as she sat up, the darkness pressing in around her. The painting was still there, but the flames seemed to be moving now, their glow faint but unmistakable. "Hello?" she whispered into the stillness. The scraping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then a deep, guttural sound broke it, like a growl, low and menacing. Lena grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the painting. The flames were still again, and the figure was in its original position. She let out a shaky breath, convincing herself it was all in her head. But as she turned off the flashlight and settled back into bed, she failed to notice the faint, smoky tendrils creeping out from the edges of the canvas, curling toward her. Lena woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was heavy with silence, yet she felt as though she'd been pulled from a nightmare she couldn't quite remember. A faint, acrid smell lingered in the air, like burnt wood. She turned her head toward the painting. The flames seemed dimmer than before, but the figure in the painting looked sharper, more defined. Its head tilted ever so slightly, as if it were staring directly at her. "You're losing it, Lena," she muttered, running her hands over her face. The morning light eventually broke through her studio's large windows, chasing away the room's oppressive gloom. The painting seemed to lose some of its menacing aura under the sunlight, and Lena decided to ignore her creeping unease. She had a client meeting later that day and needed to focus on preparing for it. Hours passed, and as she busied herself with her work, the strange events from the night before faded into the back of her mind. But when she returned that evening, the painting greeted her with a newfound intensity. The flames were brighter, the shadows around the figure more pronounced. The acrid smell had returned, stronger this time. Lena hesitated, her keys still in hand. The entire studio felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath. "I need some air," she muttered, turning on her heel. Before she could step outside, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks, a whisper so soft it was barely audible. "Lena." Her blood ran cold. She turned toward the painting, her eyes wide. The whisper came again, louder this time, and undeniably from the painting. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure in the painting seemed to shift slightly, its head tilting farther, the shadows around it deepening. The flames danced with unnatural vigor. Lena's phone buzzed, breaking her trance. It was her friend, Mia. "Hey, Lena, just checking in. How's that creepy painting going?" Lena clutched her phone tightly, her voice shaky as she replied, I think there's something wrong with it." Mia laughed, assuming Lena was joking. "You've been working too hard. Let's grab coffee tomorrow and talk about it." Lena forced a laugh, agreeing before hanging up. But the moment she set her phone down, the whisper came again, louder and more insistent. "Lena, come closer." She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The room grew colder, the air thick and oppressive. Suddenly, the light bulb above her flickered and shattered, plunging the studio into darkness. Lena grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the painting. What she saw made her scream. The figure in the painting was no longer static. It moved, slowly stepping out of the flames toward the edge of the canvas, its shadowy hands reaching out. The phone slipped from her grasp. the light spinning wildly around the room. The last thing Lena saw before the light went out was a shadowy hand emerging from the frame. Lena scrambled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The studio was plunged into an oppressive darkness, broken only by the faint glow emanating from the painting. It wasn't just a painting anymore, it was alive. "Stay back," Lena screamed, her voice trembling as she reached blindly for something to defend herself with. Her hand closed around a paintbrush, its small size offering little comfort. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices murmuring unintelligible words. The shadowy hand that had reached beyond the frame retreated momentarily, only for the entire figure to lurch closer to the edge of the canvas. Lena's phone buzzed again, a flash of light from the screen briefly illuminating the room. She seized the phone and dialed Mia's number, her fingers shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "Lena, what's wrong?" Mia's concerned voice came through immediately. "It's the painting. It's alive," Lena stammered, her voice cracking. "Lena, slow down. What are you talking about? Are you okay?" Before Lena could answer, the painting emitted a low, guttural growl. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. "Stay with me, Lena." The words sent a jolt of terror through her, and she screamed into the phone. "It's here. Mia, please help me." Mia's panicked voice was barely audible over the growing cacophony in the room. "Get out of there. I'm calling the police." The connection cut off, leaving Lena in a silence that felt more suffocating than the noise. The painting's glow intensified, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The figure was now fully out of the frame, its body unnaturally fluid as it slithered closer to her. Its eyes, hollow and black, bored into Lena with a malevolent hunger. Desperate, Lena bolted for the door, but as she reached for the handle, an invisible force slammed it shut. She turned to face the figure, her back pressed against the cold wood. "You can't leave," the voice rasped, filling the room with a chilling finality. "No," Lena screamed, hurling the paintbrush at the figure. It passed through the shadow without effect, clattering uselessly to the floor. The figure lunged, its shadowy form enveloping the room. Lena's screams echoed as the darkness swallowed her whole. The faint sound of sirens pierced the air moments later, but by the time Mia and the authorities arrived, the studio was empty. Mia stood outside the building, the late-night chill biting at her skin. The red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the otherwise quiet street, casting eerie reflections on the rain-soaked pavement. "She's not answering anymore," Mia said to the officer nearest her. Her voice wavered with desperation. "I swear she was here. She called me." The officer, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, nodded grimly. "We'll check it out. Stay here." Two officers approached the studio door, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they forced their way inside. Mia waited on the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She felt a suffocating sense of dread as she stared at the window of Lena's studio. Inside, the officers moved cautiously through the cluttered space. The smell of turpentine and old paint lingered in the air, but the studio was unnaturally cold. "Clear so far," one officer said, shining his flashlight over the paintings propped against the walls. The beam of light landed on the easel in the center of the room. The cursed painting was still there, its surface oddly pristine despite the chaos around it. The officers exchanged a wary glance. "Creepy," one muttered. He stepped closer, inspecting the figure in the painting. Something about it seemed almost too real. the details far beyond what a brush should achieve. The other officer pointed his flashlight toward the floor and froze. "Hey, there's no shadow under the easel," he whispered. "What?" The first officer turned, shining his light down. The easel stood starkly alone, but its shadow was missing entirely. Instead, a faint, human-shaped silhouette rippled on the floor near the painting, like an oil slick that shimmered unnaturally under the light. "Let's get out of here," one officer said, his voice tight. Before they could move, the shadow on the floor expanded, rising like smoke. It hovered near the painting, forming into a faint, translucent figure. Its hollow eyes locked onto them. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the room. "This is not your place." The officers stumbled back, their flashlights flickering erratically. One of them grabbed his radio, frantically calling for backup. But the static that returned was deafening, filled with overlapping whispers that grew louder and louder. The figure reached out toward them, its movements slow but deliberate. The officers bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind them. Outside, Mia jumped as the two men burst out of the building, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. "What happened? Did you find her?" she asked, panicked. The older officer shook his head. "No sign of her. Just something in there." "What do you mean, something?" Mia yelled, tears streaming down her face. The officer hesitated, then looked her in the eye. "Whatever it is, you don't want to go in there. Call someone who knows about these things." Mia's heart sank as she looked back at the studio. The warm light spilling through the window seemed less inviting now, more like a warning. Mia ignored the officer's warning. She couldn't leave Lena behind, not after hearing her desperate voice. As the officers drove away, shaken and unwilling to re-enter the studio, Mia steeled herself. The key was still in her pocket. With trembling hands, she approached the door and unlocked it. A rush of cold air greeted her, and the oppressive silence inside sent a shiver down her spine. The studio was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Mia called out softly, "Lena." There was no answer, only the faint creak of floorboards under her weight. She stepped further in, her eyes darting toward the cursed painting. It sat on the easel, its vibrant colors somehow glowing faintly in the dark. Her breath hitched. The figure in the painting looked sharper than before, its twisted smile more pronounced. Mia could swear its eyes followed her as she moved closer. "Lena, where are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. A faint sound came from behind the stack of canvases near the back wall. Mia rushed toward it, pushing aside the clutter. There, huddled in the corner, was Lena. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Mia," Lena croaked, "it won't let me go." Mia crouched down, grabbing her friend's hands. "We'll get out of here. Come on." But as she pulled Lena to her feet, the studio seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and the walls appeared to close in, as though the space itself was alive. "You can't leave," a voice boomed, reverberating through the room. Mia froze, her eyes darting to the painting. The figure within was moving now, its twisted form writhing against the canvas. The surface of the painting shimmered like water, and a shadowy hand began to stretch outward. Lena screamed, clutching Mia tightly. "It's coming! Don't let it take me!" Mia's mind raced. She grabbed the nearest object, a palette knife, and hurled it at the painting. The blade struck the canvas, tearing through the figure's face. The reaction was immediate. The room erupted in chaos as a deafening roar filled the air. The painting bled thick, black liquid from the gash, and the shadowy figure recoiled. its form flickering violently. "You dare defy me?" the voice roared. Mia didn't hesitate. She yanked Lena toward the door. The studio seemed to fight against them. Furniture toppled, and the floor buckled under their feet. The cursed painting writhed on the easel, the torn figure desperately trying to reassemble itself. As they reached the door, Mia turned back. A burst of courage surged through her, and she grabbed a bottle of turpentine from a nearby shelf. "This ends now," she muttered. She splashed the liquid onto the painting and grabbed a lighter from her pocket. With a flick, she ignited the canvas. The flames roared to life, engulfing the painting in seconds. The shadowy figure screamed, its form dissolving into the fire. The oppressive force in the room began to lift, and the studio returned to its normal, cluttered state. Outside, Mia and Lena collapsed onto the curb, gasping for air. The fire inside the studio crackled, but it didn't spread beyond the cursed canvas. Lena sobbed into her hands. "It's gone. It's finally gone." Mia wrapped an arm around her friend. "Let's hope so." As they sat there, watching the glow of the flames through the studio window, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The painting was gone, but its curse had left a scar on them both, one that might never truly fade. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal for Mia and Lena. They avoided any mention of the cursed painting, trying to bury the memories deep. The studio was abandoned, the smell of ash and turpentine still lingering in the air. Mia poured herself into her art, seeking solace in creating pieces that felt light and full of life. Lena, shaken but resilient, decided to take a break from painting altogether, focusing instead on photography. One rainy afternoon, Mia found herself wandering through an antique shop in search of inspiration. The store was cluttered with forgotten trinkets and dusty relics of the past. As she turned a corner, a familiar chill ran down her spine. There, propped against the wall, was a small framed sketch. The lines were crude, yet unmistakable. The figure from the cursed painting. Its smile was faint but knowing, and its eyes seemed to glimmer with recognition. Mia stepped back, her heart pounding. "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" the shopkeeper said, stepping up beside her. "Just arrived this morning. Unusual, though. No one seems to know where it came from." Mia forced a smile and turned away. As she walked out of the shop, the rain pouring around her, she couldn't help but glance back through the window. The sketch was still there, its faint smile seeming to widen. Some curses, she realized, are never truly destroyed. They merely wait for the next person to stumble upon them. And with that, she quickened her pace, vowing never to look back again.